In a courtroom drama that no one could have predicted, Karoline Leavitt found herself facing a $50,000 fine imposed by Judge Roberts, but she wasn't about to go down without a fight. This is a story about how one woman took on a powerful authority figure, defied the odds, and turned the tables in a way no one expected. What happened next will leave you questioning the limits of power, and just how far someone is willing to go to stand up for what they believe in. Make sure to like and subscribe, and stay tuned for an intense ride through this courtroom clash. It all started with a heated legal battle that had already drawn attention from media outlets and political pundits alike. Karoline Leavitt, known for her unapologetic stances and unwavering convictions, had been embroiled in a case that pitted her against Judge Roberts, a powerful, seasoned figure in the legal world. As the courtroom drama unfolded, no one anticipated that the situation would escalate to the point where Leavitt would find herself slapped with a staggering $50,000 fine. The tension in the room was palpable as Judge Roberts, his eyes cold and unyielding, addressed Karoline. The case at its core was a dispute over what many considered to be a violation of judicial protocol. Karoline had been outspoken about her beliefs, challenging the very system that she felt was designed to stifle dissent. Her views had earned her admirers, but they had also earned her enemies, none more formidable than Judge Roberts himself. "You seem to think your personal beliefs are above the law," Judge Roberts said, his voice stern. "For your constant disruptions, for your refusal to comply with the court's proceedings, I am imposing a fine of $50,000. This should serve as a lesson." A murmur spread through the courtroom as onlookers processed the weight of the judge's words. Was this really happening? Could anyone really just impose such a heavy fine without consequences? The room seemed to hold its breath as Karoline's face remained unreadable, but her eyes betrayed a fire that burned deeper than anyone realized. How could the system allow this to happen? Was this truly the way to silence someone with a strong voice and strong beliefs? Karoline had every reason to fight back, but what would she do? Would she accept the punishment, or would she take a stand against it in a way that no one expected? As the silence hung thick in the air, Karoline's voice finally broke through. "You may have the power to fine me, Judge Roberts, but you can't silence me," she said, her tone measured but firm. "I will not back down, not now, not ever. This fine may be a temporary setback, but it's not the end." Her words, though calm, carried a weight that resonated through the courtroom. What was she planning? How could she possibly overturn such a ruling? The question on everyone's mind was, would she find a way to use this fine against the system that had just tried to suppress her? The shockwave of her response rippled through the room. The media began to buzz. People from all walks of life, watching from their screens at home, felt a sense of disbelief mixed with intrigue. Some saw Karoline as a hero, others as a troublemaker. But one thing was certain. No one could ignore her. Judge Roberts, caught off guard by her defiance, attempted to reassert control over the courtroom. "You will comply with the court's ruling, Leavitt," he snapped, his voice sharp. "If you think your actions won't have consequences, you are gravely mistaken." But Karoline wasn't backing down. In that moment it became clear. She wasn't going to be intimidated, and she wasn't going to be silenced. The courtroom buzzed with speculation. Was this really the start of something bigger? Would this fine be the catalyst for a larger movement? What if Karoline had just begun to change the game? Would the system that tried to silence her ultimately give her more power than she had ever had before? The days following the courtroom battle were filled with heated debates. News outlets picked up the story, and soon it was all anyone could talk about. On one side, the critics of Karoline Leavitt came out in full force. They painted her as a troublemaker, someone who sought to challenge the system for the sake of gaining attention. But on the other hand, there was a growing group of supporters who saw her as a fighter, someone who wasn't willing to accept injustice, even when it came from the most powerful corners of the system. As the media frenzy continued, something began to shift. Karoline wasn't just a politician or public figure anymore. She was a symbol of defiance against a system that many felt was stacked against them. People rallied behind her, sending messages of support, sharing her story on social media, and calling for action. It was no longer just about the fine. It was about something much larger, about standing up for what was right, even when it seemed impossible. Meanwhile, Judge Roberts watched the situation unfold from the sidelines. He had expected the fine to end things, to force Karoline into submission, but instead, it seemed to have ignited a firestorm. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, not by someone so publicly outspoken. The attention Karoline was receiving was unprecedented, and it was clear that she wasn't going to let the issue fade away. Behind closed doors, her legal team began strategizing. They knew the odds were against them, but they also knew that if they could prove the fine was an abuse of power, it could change everything. They filed motions, requested hearings, and dug deeper into the case law surrounding judicial overreach. Karoline was not going to let the fine go unchallenged, not while she had the resources to fight back. But this wasn't just about the legal side of things. It was about Karoline's message. Every day she made appearances, holding press conferences, speaking at rallies, and engaging with her supporters. She wasn't just defending her own reputation. She was speaking for anyone who had ever felt oppressed or silenced. Then came a turning point. During an interview on a major news network, Karoline made a statement that would reverberate across the political landscape. "This isn't about me," she said, her voice steady but filled with conviction. "This is about every person who has ever felt like their voice doesn't matter, like they're just another cog in a broken machine. I won't be silenced, and neither should any of you." Her words echoed through the media, igniting a wave of support that was impossible to ignore. The tide was shifting. People who had previously been unsure of Karoline's motives were now backing her with everything they had. It wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about standing up for freedom, for justice, and for the right to speak one's truth. But Judge Roberts wasn't about to let this go without a fight. He doubled down on his position, claiming that Karoline's public defiance was not only disrespectful but also dangerous. The pressure on him grew, but he refused to acknowledge that perhaps he had miscalculated in his attempt to silence her. What if he had made the wrong move? Was the fine, intended to shut Karoline down, actually empowering her? Could this be the moment that turned the entire situation on its head, proving that sometimes the power of one voice can outweigh even the most well-established authority? The stakes were getting higher. As Karoline's momentum built, so did the tension. The question wasn't just whether she would win in court. It was whether this legal battle could become the defining moment of her career. Could this $50,000 fine become the spark that propelled her into a new phase of influence? Could she not only take on Judge Roberts but expose the flaws in the system that had allowed such an abuse of power to take place? The tension in the air was palpable as the next court hearing approached. The media buzzed with speculation, but the real drama was unfolding behind the scenes. Karoline Leavitt's legal team had been meticulously preparing for this moment. They knew that this wasn't just about overturning a fine. It was about exposing a much deeper issue, one that reached far beyond the courtroom and into the very heart of the political system. Karoline's supporters, who had grown by the day, gathered outside the courthouse. They were ready to see her not just fight, but win. Signs bearing her name and slogans like "Justice for All" filled the streets. The energy was contagious. People from all walks of life had come to watch what many were calling the most significant court case in years. This wasn't just a fight. For one woman, it was a fight for the rights of anyone who had ever felt persecuted or silenced. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was tense. Karoline sat in the front row of the courtroom, her posture resolute, as her legal team prepared for battle. Judge Roberts sat at the bench, stone-faced and unmoving, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Was it doubt? Perhaps a sense of unease. He had been confident in his decision to fine Karoline, but as the days passed, he couldn't ignore the mounting pressure. The national outcry had made him a target, and now the scrutiny was growing heavier by the minute. Karoline's lawyer, a sharp and calculated individual named Greg Winters, rose to his feet. His voice was calm, but carried an undeniable weight as he began his argument. He outlined how the fine levied against Karoline was not only excessive, but also violated the principles of free speech. "Your Honor," Greg began, "what we have here is not a simple case of someone breaking the law. What we have is an abuse of power. This fine was not about enforcing the law. It was an attempt to silence my client, to silence her right to speak freely." The courtroom was silent, all eyes on Judge Roberts. The tension was so thick it was almost suffocating. The stakes had never been higher. Judge Roberts cleared his throat, his gaze narrowing as he prepared to respond. "Ms. Leavitt's behavior has been disruptive and inflammatory," he said. "She has taken this matter far beyond what was necessary, and in doing so has caused a disturbance that reflects poorly on the integrity of this court." Karoline's heart pounded in her chest, but her expression remained unwavering. This wasn't the first time she had been up against powerful adversaries. It was a fight she had been prepared for, and today she would not back down. Then Karoline herself stood up. The room seemed to hold its breath as she walked confidently to the stand. The last time she had spoken out in court, it had been under the shadow of a fine, a punishment handed down by someone who thought they could control her. But today, she wasn't just defending herself. Today she was defending a principle much larger than any single case. "I'll admit," Karoline began, her voice steady but filled with passion, "I didn't expect to be here today. I didn't expect to find myself in a position where my words could be twisted and used against me. But I'm here because I believe in something bigger than myself. I believe in the right to speak, the right to challenge, the right to question authority when it goes too far." Her words rippled through the courtroom. The tension was palpable, and even the reporters in the back of the room leaned in closer, hanging on every word. "This isn't about me," Karoline continued. "This is about all of us, every person who has ever been told to stay quiet, every person who has ever been punished for speaking out. The fine is just a symbol of something far worse, a system that seeks to silence those who dare to speak truth to power." Judge Roberts shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. The room was filled with a silence that could only mean one thing: Karoline had struck a nerve. And then came the moment that would define everything. Karoline's legal team introduced new evidence. Documents revealing a pattern of judicial overreach and instances where fines had been used to intimidate individuals for exercising their rights. The documents, which had been carefully compiled, were devastating. They showed that Judge Roberts had imposed similar fines on other individuals in the past, but no one had ever dared to challenge him in this way. Karoline's supporters in the courtroom erupted in applause, but it was quickly silenced by the gavel of Judge Roberts. His face was a mask of fury, but there was no denying the truth that had just been exposed. His grip on the situation was slipping. Could this be the turning point? Could Karoline's fight for justice not only free her from the fine but also expose the deeper corruption within the judicial system? The answers seemed to be just within reach, but it was clear that Karoline's battle was far from over. She had made her mark, but the ultimate outcome still hung in the balance. The courtroom had never felt more charged than it did at that moment. The evidence Karoline's team had presented was damning, but Judge Roberts wasn't ready to surrender just yet. His face was red with anger, and the power he'd once held over the court seemed to be slipping through his fingers like sand. But in true Karoline fashion, she was ready to capitalize on his discomfort. As the applause died down, Judge Roberts attempted to regain control. "Order in the court," he barked, slamming his gavel down with a force that reverberated through the room. But the echoes of Karoline's words lingered in the air, and the audience, both in the courtroom and watching from their screens at home, was no longer so sure of the judge's power. Karoline's legal team exchanged glances. They had just witnessed a shift. The tide was turning. Greg Winters, who had been quietly observing the proceedings, knew that this was their moment. "Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering, "this case is about much more than a fine. This case is about restoring the balance of power. It's about showing that no one, not even someone in your position, is above the law." The room was still, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Karoline stood tall at the center of it all, her eyes locked on Judge Roberts. This wasn't just a fight for her future, it was a fight for the very soul of justice. Judge Roberts, though visibly shaken, attempted to regain control. "You've made your point, Ms. Leavitt," he said, trying to sound authoritative, though his voice wavered. "But you must understand the consequences of your actions. You've gone beyond the law. You've crossed a line." Karoline's voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. "No, Judge, it's you who have crossed the line," she said. "You're supposed to uphold justice, not silence it. And that's exactly what you've done by trying to impose a fine on me for speaking the truth. You've tried to punish me for challenging the status quo, for doing what every citizen has the right to do, question the system." The audience in the courtroom shifted, and even the reporters seemed to hold their breath. Was Judge Roberts, once the embodiment of authority in this room, beginning to lose his grasp? The camera panned to the gallery where Karoline's supporters were seated, their eyes filled with anticipation. Greg Winters leaned forward, speaking with quiet intensity. "Your Honor, you can try to intimidate Ms. Leavitt all you want, but the truth is, she is not the one who should be on trial. You are. You are the one who has abused your power, and it's time to answer for it." A murmur rippled through the room. The pressure on Judge Roberts was mounting, and he knew it. His once unshakable confidence was now tempered with doubt, and, for the first time, he seemed unsure of the path forward. As the room waited for his response, Karoline stood firm, her gaze unwavering. This was more than just a legal battle. It was a moment that could shift the course of history. If she succeeded, it would be a victory not just for her, but for everyone who had ever faced oppression at the hands of those who held power. This was a fight for the future of the nation. Karoline's supporters outside the courthouse grew louder, their chants reverberating through the walls. "Justice for Karoline!" they cried. It was a rallying cry that seemed to echo in the hearts of those who believed in the power of one individual to make a difference. Inside, the clock ticked down. The weight of the decision before Judge Roberts was unbearable. How could he possibly continue with the fine after the revelations that had come to light? He had no choice but to make a decision, but in that moment, he seemed paralyzed by the pressure. And then, it happened. The judge stood, his voice now cold and methodical. "The court will take a recess," he said, his tone final. "We will reconvene tomorrow to discuss the findings and render a decision." As he exited the courtroom, the tension in the air was palpable. Everyone knew that the next day would be the decisive moment. Would Karoline be vindicated? Would the judge acknowledge his error? Or would he double down on his decision, trying to salvage his reputation? The waiting game had begun, and no one could predict what would come next. Karoline, however, wasn't going to sit idly by. She was prepared to fight until the very end. Her supporters outside the courthouse cheered, louder than ever, knowing that this was a battle that would be remembered for generations. The morning of the next day arrived, and the tension was unbearable. News outlets were covering the case nonstop, and the public's anticipation had reached a boiling point. Karoline's supporters were out in full force, holding signs and chanting her name, while those who had previously sided with Judge Roberts were now questioning his actions. The once unshakable judge was now under a microscope, and the world was waiting for the outcome. Karoline, confident but focused, walked into the courtroom. Her demeanor had changed over the past few days. She was no longer just a political figure. She was a symbol of resistance. She had shown the world what it meant to stand up against corruption and injustice. She was fighting not only for her own freedom, but for the freedoms of everyone who had ever been silenced by the system. As the doors to the courtroom swung open, Karoline entered with her team. The room was packed, and the media cameras were rolling. Even those in the back rows could feel the electric charge in the air. It was clear that this was not just another case. It was a turning point. The judge took his seat, his face a mask of uncertainty. Judge Roberts had a reputation to uphold, but the events of the previous day had left him with a tough decision. The evidence against him was clear, and the public was watching his every move. Would he back down and admit his mistake, or would he double down on his previous ruling? The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the judge cleared his throat and addressed the room. The court is reconvening today to address the previous ruling regarding Ms. Leavitt's fine, he began. After careful consideration and review of all the facts, I have come to a decision. The eyes of the entire room were fixed on him. Karoline's supporters waited, breath held, knowing that this could go either way. They had witnessed her fight tooth and nail to expose the flaws in the system. But would their efforts be enough to sway the judge? Judge Roberts paused, his gaze moving from Karoline to the audience. He seemed almost hesitant, unsure of how to proceed. Then, in a moment that would go down in history, he spoke the words that would change everything. After reviewing the evidence and considering the circumstances, he said, his voice measured, I have decided to reverse the fine imposed on Ms. Leavitt. I recognize that my actions yesterday were inappropriate, and I regret the decision I made. A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom. The tension that had hung in the air for days finally broke, and Karoline's supporters erupted into applause. They had won. The judge had finally admitted his mistake and taken the first step toward restoring justice. Karoline stood tall, her face a picture of quiet triumph. She had done it. She had fought against the powerful, against the system that had tried to silence her, and emerged victorious. It wasn't just a personal win. It was a win for every person who had ever been oppressed, every voice that had been stifled by the powerful. As the applause continued, Karoline's team exchanged looks of relief and pride. This wasn't just about the fine. It was about the message it sent. It was about showing the world that no one, not even a judge, could wield power without consequences. The judge, visibly uncomfortable, glanced around the room. The once proud and commanding figure now seemed diminished. He had lost this battle, but more importantly, he had lost the trust of the public. The fine had been a symbol of his authority, but Karoline had shown him, and the world, that true authority came from integrity, from standing up for what was right, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. Karoline turned to her legal team, giving them a subtle nod of thanks. This victory was as much theirs as it was hers. The battle was over, but the war against injustice was far from finished. Karoline knew that this was just the beginning. As the judge banged his gavel to conclude the proceedings, the courtroom slowly emptied. But Karoline's victory wasn't just a fleeting moment. It was a call to action. The fight for justice wasn't over. It had only just begun. Walking out of the courtroom, Karoline was met with cheers from her supporters. Her victory was more than just a legal triumph. It was a message to the world that justice could be restored, that no one was above the law, and that the power of the people could not be silenced. In that moment, Karoline Leavitt was no longer just a politician. She was a symbol of resistance, a beacon of hope for those who had been wronged, and a reminder that sometimes one person's courage can change the course of history.